Everybody, this is Jason, and a quick note. We are returning back with brand new episodes of Historians of the Movies podcast on Thursday, January 30th. We're starting season 3 with an absolute whale of a guest. We have an Oscar-winning producer and director coming to Historians of the Movies podcast. So if you haven't subscribed just yet, make sure you do so today so you don't miss a thing. We have an amazing slate of episodes coming to you. We've already recorded 9 or 10. We've got a whole bunch more coming. So make sure you're subscribed. Season 3 is going to be bonkers. Now on with the show. Hey, everybody. This is a podcast today about one of my favorite movies, one of my absolute comfort films. When you're not feeling good, there's a host of movies that you can always put on. And for me, Chef is one of those films. I've loved it ever since I first saw it. I saw it in the theater twice when it came out in 2014, and I've loved it ever since. And fittingly, this was actually the second podcast we ever did here at Historians of the Movies podcast. We released it at the same day as we released Black Panther. And I wanted to re-release this as the last of our vault episodes before we launch into season 3. And joining us today are Emily Contois and Zenia Kish, who are two amazing scholars. And we talked today about this film, but also the rise of social media, influencers, and hashtag food porn. If you haven't seen Chef, make sure you do. It's such a fun movie to watch. It's family friendly, and there's so much food you will love. I love this movie. I think this is an awesome podcast and an awesome conversation with two amazing women, and I hope you dig the conversation. Chef is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Joining me today to talk about Chef are two scholars from the University of Tulsa. Emily Contois is Chapman Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Tulsa. She's the author of Diners, Dudes, and Diets, How Gender and Power Collide in Food, Media, and Culture, and co-editor of Food Instagram, Identity, Influence, and Negotiation. Also joining us is Zenia Kish, Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Tulsa, and co-editor of Food Instagram, Identity, Influence, and Negotiation. Emily, Zenia, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
Happy to be here.
My first question is, what's media studies, and how does that relate to the book that you just produced?
This is such a good question. They actually asked me this on my campus visit. So I wonder if they asked Zenia this as well. Like, how would you explain this to like a high school senior, right? Who probably had never heard of media studies. We don't take these classes in high school. Like, how do we help our students understand this field? And so I define it as everything that connects humanity. And so really traditional departments think of that as just like radio, television, things like film and movies, right? And then, of course, social media, digital media. But we think about it even more broadly in our department and definitely in Zenia and my work, that we're interested in what media makes possible. So for me and my work and Zenia's too, like food is a medium, right? Something that connects us, makes different kinds of communication possible. And so I'm thinking not about just cookbooks or food TV shows or awesome food films like the one we're going to talk about tonight, but also things like soil and seeds and, teaspoons and recipes, right? That these are all, mediated processes about how we connect with one another. So that's how I'd explain it. Zenia, how do you answer this one?
No, that's a great introduction and a really good question that I think we are asking ourselves all the time in the field, because one of the things that media studies scholars love to do most is push the definition of what counts as a medium and also expand the realm of what we study. So I agree. We love to think about food as media. I'm co-editing a special issue in a journal right now about farms as media, or at least all the ways that farms mediate, from literally the soil as a growing medium to all of the communication technologies that are networking our farms, from smart AI delivered internet connected tractors to all kinds of other technologies that are rendering the farm as sort of a communicative device or a field of communication in a new way. And we also think about not only the specific technologies that link us, network us, share communication information, and all of the content of those forms of communicating, but we also think about the broader networks and ecosystems that support those technologies and the meanings that are made there. So we think about the labor that goes into all forms of media production and consumption. We think about the business, the economics of it. We think about the environments of it. So environmental media is a really interesting area of study right now. So what is the carbon footprint of our streaming devices? Where do the materials come from that give us these screens, these connectors, these interfaces? And what are ways that we remake our environments through these technologies? So it's a really capacious and interdisciplinary space and lets us think about media in so many interesting ways.
Yeah. So in Food Instagram, we're thinking both about food as a medium, but also Instagram as, what we call the social media that's visual, right? Sort of the most visual of sort of our social media platforms. And there hadn't been a book, right, on food. Like at first we thought we were studying food and Instagram, right? This very popular subject and object that you end up finding on the platform. But in fact, it's more like a quasi-genre where there are noticeable conventions and norms that are aesthetic, that are content-based, and about who gathers on food Instagram and who's sharing content. So a media studies framework meets a food studies framework is very much, right, sort of where this book came from.
And so much about the early growth of Instagram is thanks in part to food cultures. Like it was one of the big forms of content production on Instagram from the very early days. And so the very first celebrity post on Instagram roped in Snoop to sort of bring some celebrity sheen to the platform and rake in new followers back in 2011. And his first post was a food placement, right? It was this new energy drink that came out. And so food content has been so important to building Instagram as a platform. And in the same way, we also look at how Instagram has changed food cultures, right? That visuality first approach of Instagram has really helped to shape and mold food cultures, foods that are made, how and where we dine, where we eat, all those sorts of things.
I'm as guilty as anybody else. I sat down at a restaurant yesterday, order my food. The first thing that happens when the shrimp and grits hits my table is I'm busting out the camera. Why did I do that?
I think one thing, like at first, I was like, we should call this book like You Are What You Post, right? Like I was really drawn to this question of identity, right? Like, Brillat Savarin from the 19th century, right? You tell me what you eat and I will tell you who you are. And so we're interested in how social media and sort of the confessional mode of our digital lives sort of expects us, right? To be you are what you post. Pics or it didn't happen, right? Like I remember back when I got engaged, right? Like, is this real if I don't post it to Facebook, which was sort of the dominant platform at that time? This idea that we live our lives and sort of perform ourselves, create ourselves, an aspirational sense of self in what we post. And so with food, that can be about, all these various parts of our identity. So our book and our contributors, think really critically about questions of race, of gender, of feminist labor, of urban-rural divides, of, different global locations as we think about how food flows, how these technologies make that possible as well. So we are what we eat in some ways. And so wanting to share it with others. And you take good food photos, right? So of course you want to share those.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot about Instagram that really prioritizes the aesthetic of the now, of the immediate, of kind of a diary keeping, as Emily said, a confessional way of sort of showing up and showing what we're doing and being present, So just as much as my students tell me all the time that one of their main ways of communicating with friends through Snapchat is just to take a selfie, random selfies throughout the day, not pose, just like, I'm here I am, this is me today, this is what I'm wearing, this is my face today. And one of the most repetitive actions we take is eating every day. We do it multiple times a day. And it's one of those moments where we're just instantiating, here's where I am, here's what I'm doing. It's a reaffirmation of me being present. And so Instagram has really privileged that kind of posting of the everyday activities as a basic way of communicating, even when you don't have content to share, just like, I'm here, I'm doing things, I'm living, this is me.
So I want to talk a little bit about Chef. And obviously, for the people who have seen this film, social media is a huge aspect. I'm kind of wondering, how your roles as media scholars kind of affects how you look at a movie like Chef or maybe anything else. Are you interrogating this movie while you're watching it?
I have to admit, cards on the table, this was my first time seeing it. So I think I'm the only one in the room here who is like processing it for the first time and putting it all together. And my scholarly instinct did drive me to look and see what have scholars written about it. I had to have a quick peek today, although I tried not to read too much and sort of shape my ideas too much. But it does add a dimension to the way I approach, especially film. I'm married to a film historian, so my whole relationship with him has been marked by learning about the deep history of films, and he's got this encyclopedic knowledge where every movie we watch, he's telling me the career arc and history of each of the actors in it, and then also the history of the studios and everything, and so it's hard for me to shut that off, but that doesn't negate my ability to take pleasure in watching things. I love film as art. I'm able to enjoy it while still bringing sort of a critical eye to what's going on, or pausing after the initial pleasures to then stop and rethink and try and contextualize what it does and doesn't do and that sort of thing. So maybe it's a mix.
No, same. I think this is like one of my favorite, sort of comfort watches. It's such a easy, pleasurable, fun movie. But I remember so I saw it when it came out in 2014. I can't remember if we went to the theater or not. We've definitely watched it, 2 or 3 times since then because it's just such a fun one. But even when it came out, I was like, this is like a dated use of Twitter, right? It was just like, I think like the social media ecosystem that it's representing was like years behind the social media moment that it was coming out. And then I think for Zenia and I, like if it came out today, right, like Instagram would be such a stronger presence in how they're promoting the restaurant and how they're showing not just, great overhead, beautiful sunlit shots of, the beautiful sandwiches and other menu items that they're making, but this idea of the spaces that they're in, right? The food cities, the inside of the truck, the work of, turning it into a business. And so I went back too. And so in the final credits, you can see, Chef Roy Choi, who's like one of the consultants on the film. And so he's one of these first big food truck people. And so in LA, so Kogi Beef comes out in 2008. So they're using Twitter, right? Twitter comes out in 2006. It was still a relatively new sort of social platform at that point. Far fewer people would be on it. So it makes sense that that's the part of his story, right? That was definitely how they were getting people to come to the restaurant. By the time this movie comes out, like it seems quite dated, that like that's sort of the way that they're using it, or that our main character would have no idea what Twitter is or how it works, that he wouldn't have an account.
You know about Twitter?
Yeah, I have an account.
Yeah? How's it work?
It's cool.
It's cool? That's how it works? It's cool?
You tweet on it.
Is that like texting?
No.
Just sign me up.
Okay. So what do you want your username to be?
Carl?
You can't just put Carl. It has to be at something.
At Carl Casper.
At Carl Casper. Taken.
Somebody took my name?
At Chef Carl Casper. Is that cool?
That's good.
At Chef Carl Casper.
So is this for sex?
Ew. Was that what you're doing this for?
No, I'm not doing it for that. So if I wrote something bad, I want to see what they wrote.
Good. Oh, shit.
Hey, you can't talk like that. I don't care if mommy's not around. I don't want you cursing around here.
That review went viral.
What does that mean?
It means it got picked up and retweeted everywhere.
So all these people have read the review?
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
But I think for me, when I was getting my master's in food studies, like food film was one of the courses that I took and that I loved. And so this genre of film has always been really, really close to my heart as one that I love watching and love analyzing. And so this one fits a lot of the conventions of the genre, as well as blurring into like some other sort of typical narrative. So we definitely have lots to talk about.
And I'll just say that timeline of always being a little behind on the social media or feeling that way, with films, it's the same timeline with academic books.
It's just like, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, we've remarked so much that, when we were approached by publishers saying, you know what, there's no book on Instagram and food, it needs to exist. And we started working on it, and 2.5 years later, it's out in the world, and everyone's asking us, well, what about food TikTok? Food Instagram feels so passé. That's so 2 years ago. And in the same way, a film from start to finish, from, filming it, editing it, but even like the earlier production and all that sort of thing. So we in media studies are very accommodated to that feeling of, if you're working on digital media in particular, you're always going to feel a little bit behind, but that doesn't mean it's irrelevant. And so these moments in time are very interesting, especially because it's doing fun stuff with blending different social media platforms and also giving us some neat, cute kind of prehistories to things today. So Vine, there are mentions of Vine in these short videos. It's like, okay, yeah, this is a history of TikTok. It's only 7 years old, but this is a prehistory of today, of the present moment.
Zenia, this was your first time, as you said earlier, it was your first time watching the film. Now, Emily and I had actually discussed previously our love for this film. We had actually done an HATM night when we ended up doing Ratatouille, but I think this was actually our first choice to collaborate, and it just wasn't available at the time. So this was kind of always on the back burner. I always kind of thought in my head, I was like, man, I really want to talk to Emily about this some more. And then when, the book just came out, then I got to be familiar with your work as well. So I'm kind of curious about what your initial response is as far as your feelings towards this film coming out. Like, it's the first time viewer of this film. How are you coming to this film? Did you like it? What are your impressions of this film just coming out?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it more than I expected. Just because I actually didn't know much about it, but so many people told me how much they liked it. And so there was almost some little instinct in me like, oh, I'm sure that's going to be like too easy to fall in love with this film. And I don't know why. It was just some kind of knee-jerk reaction. I did really enjoy it. And partly because it had more layers to it than I anticipated. There was a lot more going on. And I think, people mentioned, oh, yes, social media is a part of it, but I didn't realize like how much it was a part of it and how interesting it was. And part of it is for capturing that moment in time. And part of it is the way that it's not only about the like digital social media platforms that are kind of being incorporated, but I found it fascinating how it incorporated so many popular media genres that I was constantly jumping to see all these different influences. And it wasn't just cliche. It was kind of stitching together the kind of chaotic moment of all of these social or reality TV influences. You've got these little sort of snippets where it's borrowing from all kinds of food TV, from the competitive food TV genre to that kind of remaking of or saving a restaurant through a flailing restaurant and resuscitating a chef's career as a whole other subgenre of food TV. But also the road trip is going on, but you've also got the makeover TV elements as well. Like you've got, right from selecting the swatches in Robert Downey Jr.'s office to cleaning out the truck and kind of rehabbing it. It's got that moment of kind of like renovation and design, home makeover kind of show as well. And so you've got this father-son bonding and the road trip elements, and then the kind of like food tourism elements as well around the US. And so for me, what was most striking was just how much was squeezed in there in ways that felt a bit dizzying at times, but coherent because it reflects a lot of how we feel in this fast-paced, social media-driven attention economy, where we are kind of confronted with all of these stories that are kind of borrowing little tropes and genres from each other and finding fragmented storyscape in which we are drawn to films to tell complex stories, but we're also simultaneously commenting on them in short tweets or in longer video commentaries or in these down to these 1-second videos that the Sun is taking and compiling. It just was a neat reflection of our mediascape through his engagements with food. And so it left me thinking about a lot there. So that's like kind of a media commentary. And then the other little thing that I'll just throw out to see what you all think, but it really struck me how much it felt like a precursor to this conversation we have a lot right now, precipitated by social media about like the importance of affective connection through social media. So there was a lot of moments that I was like, okay, this is about vibes, right? This is all these little moments planted, the little snippets, the posts. It really speaks to this moment we have now where a lot of meme making is really about just kind of sharing a feeling that you can see and instantly connect with. And food is such an important medium for that, right? Because we have such emotional, cultural, and identity attachments to food. So it adapts so well to this high-paced multimedia environment. So those things really jumped out at me.
Emily, you've seen this movie, you said a few times. I remember seeing it. I saw it twice in the theater when it came out. I've seen it. I will probably watch this movie once every 2 to 3 months. Someone, when I mentioned this on Twitter the other day, said, this is my comfort movie. And for me, it's definitely one of those. I'm wondering, Emily, have you've seen this multiple times over the course of the last 8 years since it came out? How do you approach this film, say now versus when you first saw it? Have you thought about it? Do you think about it differently now?
So when I first saw it, I was just starting my dissertation. So I was thinking about masculinity in food, but I hadn't sort of figured out dude masculinity yet. So I didn't read him through that lens the first time. He's this very likable, but dude chef. That the dude, right, is this sort of lovable slacker. Right. And so there's, of course, this element where he is a driven chef, right? That he wants to be pushing the envelope, whether it's with technique or ingredients, and really making food that represents who he is and that he can be proud of, that will make eaters happy and will serve critics. And so when he takes this moment where he walks away from, fine dining and wants to have the food truck and just make good food that people will love, that's a kind of dropping out, right, of a particular kind of culinary rat race. The questions of work-life balance, that this professional world is one where it's very, very difficult to have a family, worse than academia, right, to be able to actually balance everything. And so for that father-son element to come through, it reminded me of some of the stuff that I wrote about Guy Fieri, right, of how he's able to be this sort of dude rocker chef who's, written inbounds of masculinity through being this really loving, involved dad who'd always involved his children in his programs. So there's the dude chef element that I definitely didn't see the first time that rings true. When he takes off his chef whites, the sort of, professional garb of the chef, whether that, I've talked a lot with my students about the role of the sexy chef and how that always gets to be this archetype that's sort of masculine and male. But when he takes that off, right, it's to put on plaid, right? And to go pick up his child. And I think Favreau wrote, directed, starred, and that from his previous indie career, he's always written himself in sort of a self-deprecating way. And so again, there's kind of these dudeish elements that he's leaning into, whether it's about his body. There's all the critic doesn't just critique the food at the restaurant, it sort of critiques the chef.
Carl Casper can best be summed up by the first bite of his needy and yet by some miracle also irrelevant chocolate lava cake. Casper didn't even have the courage to undercook the cake, thus curiously lacking its signature molten center. This sad dessert is emblematic of Carl Casper's disappointing new chapter. His dramatic weight gain can only be explained by the fact that he must be eating all the food sent back to the kitchen. 2 stars.
There were interesting pieces there of the embodiment of a particular kind of masculinity too. But watching it again, it is such a beautiful food film. There are so many cooking scenes. Some of the conventions of a food film are, that food fills the screen. So we're going to have these close-up shots of, really beautiful food, often very impressive, sort of knife skills and sort of elevated, techniques compared to the home cook. And that food drives the narrative. And so this film does both of those things in such a beautiful way. And there are so many scenes that really are about the food, that incite all of your senses, that are just spectacular and sort of draw you in. And those were always there, but they just really struck me this time. I'm just oh, look how beautiful that is. And there's all these spots where they sort of the camera gazes up from his hands chopping to his arm and his body to be haha, Jon Favreau is actually right, doing this. He actually, perfected sort of the knife skill work to be able to embody the chef. And so I think it's a very dude movie. There aren't a lot of women characters. It doesn't pass the Bechdel test. There aren't women who talk to one another. Sofia Vergara is, incredibly beautiful. And my students pointed this out this semester, right? That for a kind of average looking guy to have a very beautiful wife is sort of this television cinema trope that we don't really question. But if it's the reverse, right? A sort of average looking woman with a really attractive husband, we have to explain it, or it becomes a plot point, or it's something that's addressed. And so it has that, and then it has this very bro-y quality of the kitchen, which can have a really lovely quality. Even as a woman viewer, they're funny. They have this community. His friend shows up and, joins him to do the food truck. There's no pay. It's just sort of a brotherly act of sort of, professional taking a chance. We're going to launch this together. But at the same time, this does show that sort of front of the house, back of the house divide in gendered labor in the professional food world. We have men and women graduating from culinary school at exactly the same rate. And we still have 80% of head chefs positions in this country filled by men. So you still see that. There's elements of this that I can't let go from that feminist perspective, but it's still a movie that I enjoy and that I really like watching.
I might jump in there and also just draw out, of course, his whiteness, right? Really does a lot for him. Like, he's one of the few straight up white characters in this who's kind of absorbed and naturally and unquestionably become an expert chef in all of the different cuisines that he picks up along the way. He kind of insinuates himself into Miami Cuban culinary culture, but then he's also got this Southern thing going on. He's picking up on the French New Orleans. And so his ability, and then of course, just this kind of unquestioned loyalty that as head chef that he's unquestionably earned from his sous chefs who are, you know, racialized. And it kind of points to these dynamics of the food industry in particular as being a really important locus for thinking about immigration and racialization and labor politics across the US in these like subtle little ways that it kind of nods to but doesn't do much with. So, you know, he's able to get away with a lot, and he's able to, in his white universal manhood, sort of slip into and absorb and become an expert in and become accepted and loved for being able to pick up and be really skilled at learning all of these different ethnic cuisines and then offering it back to these very same communities from whom it's emerged, right? And we get these little nods to that here and there in some interesting ways. I mean, there was that little throwaway comment even from Sofia Vergara when she's trying to convince him to come to Miami, and he's like, what, to nanny my own son? And she's like, well, you know, the nannies can't come on the plane. And that's it. And then you just move on. And then it's this white man doing a road trip. And it's kind of an ode to his mobility. And I've seen this movie read actually as a Bildungsroman, which is a neat way of thinking about it through the genre of that like individual story arc of kind of personal development through challenge, but also cultural kind of apprenticeship and learning and development and that sort of thing. And that's true often through some kind of grand journey, right? And you end up in this better, stronger, more complex, like more self-confident place. And it is that for him. And he's got that freedom to move, but it doesn't really question the limits on mobility of so many other people, you know, either stuck in the US or trying to get to the US and unable to come in, and the limits of the food industry in particular on exploiting undocumented labor, but not ameliorating these contradictions around migrant labor in the U.S., the kind of silent, unwritten exploitation that underwrites so much of the economy. So those forms of like his entrepreneurial self-development and self-fulfillment through like being broken down, but then relearning his craft and his personal expression and all that sort of thing, and coming back to his family is very much a story of white masculinity, white entrepreneurial masculinity in the US as well.
No, definitely. And I think that was something I noticed this time too, like thinking about food trucks, right? This gourmet food truck revolution, you know, that we had sort of 2009, 2010, that starts in places like LA and then sort of takes over the country. That before that, like it was the taco truck, and it was understood in distinctly ethnic terms that it was food that was very affordable, very fast, intended for a working class worker, most often from a Latinx background.
I got a food truck.
Get the hell out. No shit, you got a fucking taco truck? Tony, Carl's got a fucking taco truck.
For real? Jefe, like with tacos and shit?
Yeah, I would assume. What are you gonna cook?
And so to then have the gourmet food truck, which offered great food, and it has, you know, the mobility, you don't have the same costs as brick and mortar. It was, you know, opened lots of doors for plenty of food entrepreneurs, but was also much more expensive, more esoteric ingredients, imagined a very different sort of white affluent audience. And so, no, I really appreciate Zenia making us remember, right, this question of race and ethnicity sort of all throughout the film, and what its absence in particular moments tells us as well.
And a footnote on that, it therefore becomes a film about food tourism, right? And that's something that certain privileged global citizens have a lot of access to, but it's also like a whole entertainment genre of Americans and Europeans traveling the world to discover street food in its authentic context and then bringing it back, and then looking for the local food trucks to give them that experience of street food. And even the idea of like food truck parks, like in Austin, you go to the food truck parks and you can stand in one place and be that tourist and sort of get your fusion foods from, you know, New Mexican, Californian, Vietnamese street food all blended together in a taco or something, you know. And so it reproduces that kind of food tourism aesthetic but also opens questions about it, I would hope. And I think that savvy viewers will see it and ask about that access that he has. Yeah, that to me was one of the more interesting elements of the film.
And I mean, the food cities they go to, right? Jason, we're just talking around you. You asked a good question. We can just run with it.
Go.
So like, but like Miami, New Orleans, Austin, Los Angeles, like these are really interesting food cities. And from racial histories, ethnic histories, immigrant histories, migrant histories, they're all cities like that, that have so much to offer. So it makes sense that these are the cities that they highlight and the foods of each place as well, right? Like beignets is on the menu, right? As they go to LA. And I mean, from the very beginning, right? That scene where he takes his son to the farmer's market, like he's already talking about ingredients like plantains. He's talking about beignets, like he's planting food memories and talking about them right before they've been able to have this trip together and this time together to build these food memories as father and son.
Well, I want to ask you now actually about representations of food themselves on screen. So for instance, has grilled cheese ever had a better moment in the history of film than it did in this movie?
No, like this is such a good grilled cheese scene. And I mean, obviously, like grilled cheese on the griddle, is different than these sort of Cuban sandwiches. But I feel like it's almost a kind of foreshadowing, right? That he's like making this grilled cheese, right, with like all the butter and this beautiful bread, and like it looked like 3 or 4 different kinds of cheese, right? Like tons of slices. This is an amazing, it just makes you salivate, as you watch it on the screen. That it's foreshadowing of like the sandwiches they're going to build together, the journey that they're going to go on that they don't even know is around the corner for them. That I love that scene, not only for like how delicious that sandwich looks, but for the work it does in the narrative as well. Like it's a well-constructed sort of element of that early part of the movie.
Have either of you tried to make any of the recipes that are in this film yet?
No.
I haven't either. I am a good eater. I'm not a particularly good cook. Jason, you can make them. I'll come eat them if you make them.
Were you inspired to make any of them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I will 100% out myself as the dude chef here, because I remember watching this film. I was like, well, if he could make that for Scarlett Johansson, I will learn to make that for Scarlett Johansson. And I like that's my go-to meatless dish, that pasta with the lemon and garlic. Oh my gosh, it's so simple and easy. And yes, I've tried to make that grilled cheese for my kids, and no, they want no part of it whatsoever. They want the slices of American cheese with the crusts cut off. But I will tell you, there's actually this very real moment in the film that I actually very much relate to, which is when he goes back into his home kitchen after he's been fired and released from his job. And he is really kind of doing a I'll show you kind of scene where he's going through and making those dishes. And for me, one of the things that I very much like to do is actually to spend time in the kitchen, because it is a creative outlet for me where I can put on music, I can pour a glass of wine, and I can, through labor, create something that is a complete unwinding for me after I'm spending time doing. And I think this isn't, unique to me as a historian, but I think a lot of folks are like that, where they will just go into there. But the interesting thing here, like that I think about this film is I spend a lot of time cooking. It is a thing that I very much enjoy doing. And we see this as a very, as you were both saying, this is a very gendered kitchen, right? The interesting thing for me growing up is that we also had a gendered kitchen in my own household, but it was completely opposite. Men were not to be in the kitchen. That was the domain of my grandmother, of my Aunt Diana, of my mom. And when men cooked, it was exclusively on the grill outside. There's been some kind of change here, and I can't describe what that is, because as much as I cook, I can tell you, no one would teach me to cook growing up. I would beg my grandmother, teach me to make this. No, this is not for you to make. This is for the women to make. And that's what she would say. So I'm kind of wondering, if you can maybe kind of speak a little bit to, what's responsible maybe for that change in cultural norms?
So I think in media representations, that's part of why writing Diners, Dudes, and Diets was so frustrating, right? It's a 2020 book, and a lot of the examples are of gender conventions that are Victorian. Like it's very much sort of like separate spheres, and the private and the public, the domestic and the world of work, and this very sort of feminized idea of food and cooking as labor, as nurturance, as duty, while the professional kitchen is this domain of men that's sort of creative and stylized and glamorized, right? And sort of the media that depicts it. And so I think, in my thinking of masculinity, people write about the metrosexual and sort of the compatriot of the gastrosexual, that as norms of masculinity shifted in their relationship to consumer culture. So it's not just cooking, but also like caring about fashion and using skin products and, all of these other things that sort of shape, how men be men and sort of perform masculinity, how folks who aren't men can perform masculinity too. And so that was one sort of shift in the grand, long narrative of different masculinity types. And so food was part of that, right? Knowledge about food. And then also like Zenia and I write about sort of, like food porn as a concept that comes out of the late 1970s. And the word foodie like comes shortly after it, right? Like right around 1980. And, if you think about things like the mainstreaming of sushi in the United States, right? That it goes from this, viewed as other foreign sort of taboo food, to eat raw fish. Oh my goodness, raw fish. Cut that out to our editor.
I want all the sushi. I am ready right now. I am ready for poke. Like, yes.
So just like all these big shifts happened in food culture, the American palate became just more open and people became a lot more interested in food. And so we see things like, Bourdieu's understanding of, social capital and cultural capital expand to culinary capital. That Katie Lebesco and Peter Naccarato both sort of like continue theorizing that like food becomes this like significant space for a legitimate kind of capital in society. So that's a really long-winded way of saying that like gender norms were shifting, food culture and trends were shifting, our food media environment was rapidly proliferating. And so all that's happened during your lifetime of sort of this shift, right? Of like, where does food fit into our lives? Who is it for? What are the boundaries around it? And so the fact that you cook a lot and want to, and even wanted to as a kid is like a very hopeful, wonderful sign. I think what I found, so dismaying as I wrote my book, the first one, was that like, there was still so many really regressive messages about food and gender and cooking and bodies. And so we want men to cook. We want everybody, right? If they want to find that joy in the kitchen, to find it. Although I'll be super honest that like, I don't find joy in cooking right now. Like it took so much of my brain and all my energy to do these 2 books in 4 years. Like I don't have anything left to go into the kitchen. Like I'm actually writing about that right now, of just like, that disappeared. What does it mean to be someone who my whole intellectual life is about food? But like my personal life with food, like it didn't survive, right? Doing all this academic work about it and like rebuilding it will be something I have to be patient about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big arc of kind of neoliberal globalization and changing taste cultures and changing gender norms that Emily talked about are really line up with, those intersect with our lives in very personal ways. For me, growing up in the suburbs of Toronto, and it was, I think the case for many in the 80s and 90s, it was my dad, who was the international businessman who would go and have his business lunches, and he would try all these new foods in downtown Toronto, and he would go on business trips all around the world and come back and tell us about all the things he loved that he discovered that was new. And then he would go, and I was just always amazed since I was a kid that he would just go and like take a class and learn how to make sushi himself, when none of my friends had tried it before, and come home and make it and have dinner parties. And so for me, it was just a kind of an assumed sense of this globalized cosmopolitanism that it was my dad that was often going and trying these new things and then really excited to come and share it with the family and often figure out how to make it. And so that's kind of, a privilege of mobility and class and those sorts of things. And also a middle class aspirationalism, this idea of like being global citizens and just how that became this celebrated narrative and how much that was absorbed into popular culture. But it's also very very moving. And it's also, as shown throughout this film, but also like a staple of so many of these kinds of food films and food narratives generally, is that making food for people is one of the most direct, intimate forms of care and connection in our closest relationships. And so to me, it's just beautiful to see how these things are able to change or maybe return to older, more organic relationships where our elders can sort of, regardless of gender, can cook for us or have their own specialized kitchen skills that they bring to the table or that they bring to the family. I mean, I'm just falling in love with the fact that my dad in his retirement in the last couple of years has returned to the kitchen like full force, and he's trying all kinds of things. I can send him any recipe. He's learning how to make bread, but he's also going back to our Ukrainian, roots and not only learning or relearning how to make a lot of the core staple dishes, but reinventing them. So just, what was it? Just, he's inventing lobster pierogies and just kind of doing this kind of mashup that I think is an incredible expression of creativity and just a joy in feeding the family. And he's really taken off with that. And it's beautiful to see that like celebrated as a story, even as it doesn't necessarily like break down our binary gender expectations. And it's often like more celebrated in some cases and less in others, and often continues to kind of belittle the often feminized women's labor in the kitchen, the expectation that women like nourish the family, but men are celebrated for the artfulness they bring or the special occasions or that one special dish they've perfected. And so, there continues to be a reproduction of a lot of these gendered norms through these things. But we are seeing big cultural shifts that both push us forward, but also we have to be very attentive to how they can reinforce longstanding norms.
So Jason, I didn't realize you'd watched this movie so many times. Like, what do you love so much about this movie? Like, I've seen like 3 or 4 times. Like, you've seen it a lot.
I've seen this film probably at least 20 times. And that goes to a lot of different things. First of all, my love actually of film, my love of Jon Favreau, actually.
Yeah,
who
he's
I very
so likable.
encountered in PCU. You talk about a film in which he does not appear very well. I think for a lot of young men of the 1990s, obviously Swingers became this very important moment. And I very much actually want to talk about it, that film and that time as a historical artifact at some point in time, because I think Favreau was onto a lot of different things at that point in time. I think Favreau is this really interesting filmmaker. He really kind of created the MCU with Iron Man. He's kind of in a lot of ways re-energized the Star Wars universe with Mandalorian and the work that he's doing. And then he goes off and kind of comes back. He kind of makes this movie on the side. It's a small, very personal film. For me, I very much relate to the idea of a divorced husband with children. For me, we talk a lot. I think this movie becomes a film that we say, oh, it's a food movie, right? And it is. Food is a big thing. But I think for me, what really appeals to me is like this very inward journey of this man who has clearly lost his way. Has kind of got quite literally goes back to his roots, goes back to Miami. And in the process of finding Miami, he finds his son, ultimately finds the love of his life again, finds the love of his work. It reaffirms his bonds with his friends, John Leguizamo, who I think is just phenomenal in this film.
He's
as
so
he is
good
in
in
just,
this.
he
Yeah.
just interjects so much into this movie, right? It's a short film. You can get through it quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice. You can share it with a friend. You can watch it with somebody. I think one of the big knocks on the film that people came out and said, oh, well, everything works out in the end.
It is like such a fairy tale ending, right? It's like it's not a big white wedding, which is like such a trope, right? It's a small white wedding. You have the fairy godmother, right? Who shows up to like invest in your restaurant. Like it's like such a lovely, right? Because like life doesn't get to be like that, right? And so for that comfort watch, like it is so nice.
Well, I want to believe that because the fairy godmother was actually the Wicked Witch of the West to begin with, right? He's the prime villain early on. He's part of the instigation of this, and yet here he becomes the ally at the end of this. You see this he becomes an ally because I think in a lot of ways Favreau's journey allows him to realize that he was never the villain to begin with. He was actually the man speaking truth to him the whole time, right? And sometimes it takes a long time for us to realize that the people that we associate with negativity are actually speaking to us in a completely different ways once we kind of reposition ourselves. So I think that there's so much going on with this film, that this inward journey. And of course, look, the food porn is fantastic. It's
a beautiful movie.
And the soundtrack is phenomenal. The soundtrack.
Yes, I was going to say, I wrote music on my notes. I was like, we haven't talked about the soundtrack.
Right, well, let's talk about the music.
compa de esta rumba, un trozo de palo en mano y con buena puntería. Tiene que atinarlo bien porque viene Luis María.
I have the soundtrack on Spotify. I listen to it all the time when I'm cooking. To anybody who follows me on Twitter, you know that I grew up in Louisiana. So when they hit New Orleans and they hit part of, even though I grew up in Cajun country and Breaux Bridge, there is a very real tie for me to hearing those sounds and seeing those sights. Tell me how you relate to this with the music and the film itself.
Oh, I think just like the level of energy that the soundtrack brings, right? Like it's so not orchestral, just sort of like background, or like I was going to say, when we think about other food films, like Jiro Dreams of Sushi, right? These like gigantic, big classical, sort of notes that like speak to, like this is like so energetic, so fun. Like you just want to dance to like, which I mean, people talk, like a culinary ballet, right? Of like what's happening in the kitchen, like all the movement and the energy that's there. But also of the genre is being represented, that they're so deeply rooted in a sense of place. Like it's really about sort of the road trip elements, as we get going. But even in the opening scene, those rhythms of Miami, even when he's not there, right? They're sort of like, they're calling him, they're a part of who he is, his history, the food that he thinks is good and delicious and wants to be making. No, I think the music is really unique and really wonderful. And I love that you're listening to it all the time. Maybe I need to be doing that too.
I have a Spotify cooking playlist that I put on that is heavy on I was actually looking the other day, the very first song that I ever played on Spotify was Crayola by Jimmy Buffett, which speaks to cooking and growing up and the sounds of the kitchen. It was a song that was introduced to me by my former father-in-law, who he and I bonded over food and wine. And then that became my cooking song. That's called my Crayola playlist.
I'd never like really listened to the lyrics of Sexual Healing, right? Or just like, I'm hot like an oven. Like I totally somehow missed, like all the food metaphor in that. They're like even songs that, you don't think of as sort of like culinary.
And that rearrangement
is really good. And then all
good.
Singing it together, like it's really fun.
Baby, I'm hot just like an oven. I need some loving. I can't hold it much longer. It's getting stronger and stronger. When I get that feeling, I want sexual healing. Sexual healing.
Yeah, and the intergenerational, and then like watching the concert together, he and his son, and the live music. Because it's my first time watching it, I was so absorbed in the story and the visuality of it. I was attentive to the sound, but haven't listened as closely as you have. So for me, it was more just a very interesting and relevant soundscape that literally did make them move, and groove and dance to all of these scenes of happiness. And just, the music often accentuated those moments when Favreau or everyone in the kitchen would like fall into their rhythm of cooking. And so it was often like, this is a marker of being in your body, just like cooking and eating is, like being connected with music definitely is an expression of that. And so that physicality really pervades all of these different dimensions of the film. And so I think that having sounding all those different notes as markers of place, but also as markers of kind of connecting to different facets of cultural identity in the places that they go. And, especially for the son, in a way, he's kind of introducing his son to all of these cultural influences that made him. And it's through all of these cultural sources of joy and pleasure, which is both ingredients and visiting the farmers markets and all these places and learning about why you want to pay attention not only to the radishes that you're buying, but why the radish greens are also important. So you're learning and conveying all of this, reproducing all of this, cultural knowledge through these forms of art. And so I think that it does use music very effectively to feed into that. And also, it really complements, as we've kind of noted in a couple of places, how process oriented this film is. So you're getting such long, indulgent, really, portrayals of the preparation of food, but also all the other processes. It doesn't rush through walking through the farmer's market and picking out the ingredients, and it doesn't rush us through the cleaning of the truck, right? Like for a lot of Hollywood storytelling, that's not fabulous editing that you're spending so much time looking at each step, but that speaks to in some ways, some of the other media genres that are being drawn on here, just how important it is in our reality-driven TV culture and makeover TV to like depict the steps and show how things are made. We really are in a cultural moment where people want to see behind the scenes and how things are made. And so, and social media is another place that gives us that access, right? So many of the things that we look at on Instagram and talk about in the book, but that we also see in YouTube, how-to videos and TikTok and all these places, people are really, really interested in like, how are things made? What are the steps that you go through? Tell me the instructions. Tell me how to do each thing or how to do things right or do things better. And the film also really sinks into that. It really gives us all of those moments of like picking out a knife and learning what a knife's function is, right? It's giving us the tools and the pieces and the steps along the way and not just the final, money shot of the food pornographic kind of image, like here's the final dish. And it's not even just the plating, which is also a real convention of food film and especially food pornographic indulgences. But it's really like there's a lot of steps that go into getting there. And so it really lets us sink into process in so many ways. And music is just an accentuator of that. Music takes time, right? Music is a measure of time. And it's one of the ways that we keep rhythm as we do a lot of these everyday tasks. We listen to music to pass the time when we're on long road trips. We turn up the music when we're spending time in the kitchen preparing all of the ingredients to really like get that big dinner together. It's hours of time, and music is very often a way that we keep time and also that we connect to our cultural heritage and with each other. And so all of those sensual elements are really nicely done in the way that they're put together.
I also love you bringing up the scene where he gives his son his first chef's knife. Like, it almost makes me cry. It's such a really endearing, heart-touching, father-son moment of, passing on knowledge, giving a tool, a way of sort of teaching him how to be a man, how to be a chef. Like, it's just such a sweet scene. Like, I love it every time I see it.
Okay, you see this, Percy? That's a chef's knife, a real chef's knife. It's not a toy. You understand? This thing's sharp. It could send you to the hospital if you're not careful. I'm going to teach you how to use this thing. But a chef's knife, it belongs to the chef, not to the kitchen. So it's your responsibility to keep it sharp, clean, not to lose it. Could you handle that?
Yes.
This is a good knife. It'll last you a long time if you take care of it. Don't lose it.
I won't. Thank you.
You earned it.
I actually think about that scene quite a bit because, I'm constantly cooking with my two boys when they're over here with my house. My 14-year-old is getting really, really talented on the traditional kettle style grill, but also on the smoker. And now my 10-year-old is kind of coming behind him, and now he's helping me to make, spaghetti sauces. And, we're doing the simpler things with him. This is a thing that I can share with the boys that is tangible, that will serve them well as they get older. And there's actually a food scene that I think about in a completely different film. And I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was a film with Michael Keaton and Nicole Kidman years ago called My Life. Are you familiar with this film?
No, I don't know that one.
This film years ago actually takes place through the power of a different kind of social media, where Michael Keaton's character is suffering from a terminal illness. His wife is expecting, Nicole Kidman. And so he starts creating these videos, quite literally videos of himself to teach his child after he departs about life. And there's all these confessionals like, okay, you meet a girl, she breaks your heart. What do? Right? There's this famous scene where he's like, okay, this is how you teach spaghetti. You've got to nurture the noodles. You got to take the sauce. You got to slow it up. And it's like, okay, you're in college. You only got one pot. Boom, done. So I think about these things in terms of like, this is as a father, as a man, to my two male children who I am trying to also impart to them, okay, this is how I understand what I do as a man. These are some of the skill sets that I hope you learned that I had to figure out on my own, right? So I kind of relate to Carl Casper very much in that way. And I've actually had those thoughts in my head. Not that I trust either one of my children with knives. So I do want to be clear with that. I had my older boy, we were making gumbo the other night. I was like, here's celery, here's a knife. I've got the phone. Let's go. I do think about this film, though. I'm kind of interested to hear your thoughts as far as this film, because we think about it as far as a food movie, And I think all these food movies that we've seen in the past or in the present day kind of use food to kind of tell different stories, whether they're romances. I'm thinking about the Aaron Eckhart, Catherine Zeta-Jones film that came out a few years ago, or they're telling different things, very other inward stories, say like with Bradley Cooper's Burnt. Or, maybe the best comparison its use of social media might be Julie and Julia. So I'm kind of thinking, how does this film to you kind of compare to other movies of this era?
The food films or like other films?
Like where does this fit in food films today? Like what is this movie doing that other films aren't, or how does this maybe compare to other films that are kind of coming out?
It reminds me a little bit of Julie and Julia, right? Like Nora Ephron. She's so brilliant in how she is telling a story more about women and sort of their journeys to find themselves and what they're meant to do. Like it is kind of a parallel narrative of our chef Casper here, right? Finding what he's meant to do and to sort of find his motivation and his joy again, to really feel happy. That Julie and Julia is doing that too. But I think both of those films, like they're still in an indie model, but they were both created at a moment where the food film genre was no longer just, really wonderful international films or like truly indie produced films, right? That were much smaller, had much smaller distributions, were seen by much smaller audiences. Like thinking of Big Night, right? Like Stanley Tucci, like right back, at the beginning of his career. Like I love Big Night so much, but like they're quieter movies, they're slower movies, they're smaller stories. You have to really stay with them and pay attention to every frame, to get everything out of them. And so even though like both Chef and Julia there's still elements of that where they're a little bit slower. You have to love the food to sort of be in it. They are a little bit more of like a Hollywood commercial model. They feel like sort of bigger films. I think The 100-Foot Journey sort of feels like that too. Like that because food films became so popular and audiences loved them, that they got bigger budgets and bigger stars and told different kinds of stories. And so I feel like they're a part of a different moment in sort of food film history, and that there are certainly similarities, to the earlier ones, but they're also different, that they're made for a more welcoming, ready audience, that was hungry for the content that was much larger and had sort of more maybe sort of culinary knowledge, right? To be able to dive into them, that it was a different moment that way. So that's one idea.
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I'm maybe a little less of an expert on food film, so I don't have like as wide a range of comparison to really think that through. But one of the things that does strike me is that a lot of, especially in the US, but I think it's probably also true in many European films traditions, is that there's often like some stories are about reproducing or connecting families across generations and maintaining culture while also showing, cultural change over time and things like that within a particular culture. And then also food often tends to be a conduit for telling immigrant stories as well, like stories of movement, narratives of migrating, of integrating, but also maintaining connection, but also intergenerational, conflicts and change within migrant family stories. And so this is kind of trying to almost have both of those, right? To tie those together. Like it is about the reproduction of this like white man's family through sharing those connections with his son and teaching skills, but also his broader community, his relationship with those in the kitchen and that sort of thing, and reinventing and getting to know himself and, that sort of thing. But it's also like around all the edges, it speaks to US cuisine as being so heavily infused with migration stories, right, that are told through foods. And so it's doing that in maybe some uneven ways that we've already talked about. But I think that in that way, it's kind of pulling on these different threads and trying to bring them together in a kind of collage. And so yeah, I think we could look at that in a number of ways. And I think that would both draw recognition, but also critiques about some of the easy ways that it kind of flattens, Latinx cultures and influence in history in the US, while still trying to give tribute in sometimes very easy ways. I think those are the strongest connections I would think of. It also really does I was waiting to see if it would do something really original or different in its depiction of food. And it does it very well, but I'm not sure that I saw new things in how it's like visually working with food. Like some of the angles were a little bit different. It wasn't just the overhead flat lay, and it wasn't just, it's some really interesting moments visually, but it wasn't actually reinventing anything about like food depiction or food stories. So I think the way that we're talking about it as a comfort film, as in comparison to comfort foods, like it's drawing on a lot of familiar things, a lot of familiar ingredients, right? And a lot of familiar media tropes, and it's well done. It's really well done, but it doesn't necessarily like do anything new in those domains.
Well, in comparison to those other films that we're talking about, maybe we can talk about what I'm thinking about is each one of you kind of give to us 3 films in a book about food, or that use food to tell these stories, things that you like a lot that maybe our audiences aren't familiar with.
Okay, so I don't know if I can limit it to 3, so I'm already going to wreck your segment.
Do as many as you want.
And so you can't see, but like on my wall, right over here where we're recording, I have this beautiful color poster for Tempopo, which is a 1980s Japanese film of, like a ramen restaurant. And there's all these little vignettes like to teach one food film where you can cover all the conventions, all the ideas of dairy. Like it covers so much. So I love that food film, like very, very much. I also like Goodfellas is not a food film, but like there is so much awesome food in it. Like so many scholars have written about Goodfellas and, the many, right, sort of like Italian gangster films of like Italian food culture being so central to ideas about family, about loyalty, about tradition. Like, I mean, I think Goodfellas is like the scene where they're in prison, like slicing the garlic is like one of my favorites. The scene at the end, right, making the sauce, right, like we were talking about the passage of time and the tension, right? That like making the sauce as everything is falling apart with the helicopters overhead, right? Like it's just so well done. Like I love that movie for interesting reasons, and like food is part of it too. It's like one of Christopher's favorite movies. So it's like you live together, grow alike. Like I don't know that I would have loved Goodfellas before I ended up with this particular boy. And then a newer one, which goes back to Historians at the Movies, right? With our first movie being, a Nicolas Cage film that like I thought Pig was amazing, which came out relatively recently, right? With Nicolas Cage, as a chef who's sort of become a recluse and was very well renowned. And like, it's a really interesting food film that's not just about like plating and in the kitchen and beautiful food, but thinking about like spaces, thinking about life, thinking about ingredients and cooking for people and what it means to be at the end of your hope. Like, I really like that one. And then one that isn't a film, but is a TV show, The Bear, came out on Hulu this just past summer. And it's so tight. I think it's like 8 episodes. They're like really brief. And they are all so tense. Like it's a show you cannot binge. And so I think to Zenia's point, right, of like the chef didn't do anything particularly different, right? And how it's showing cooking, food, the different cinematography that we come to expect for food porn sort of shots. That The Bear is something that, current chefs and hospitality workers have said they can barely watch. It's so accurate to the tension, the heat, the pace, the difficulty, the exhaustion of working in a professional kitchen. And so it was so unique that way, in addition to being just a really, really well-made, well-written sort of story and program. But I think one thing that you see a little bit in Chef that I really, really loved about The Bear is not how people, look at the food porn, but like the faces of pleasure that people make when they eat someone's food, that like we as viewers get to have this vicarious experience of like, oh, how good that food tastes and how much they respect that chef and love the food and perhaps love the person, right? Depending upon the narrative. And in The Bear, like there are multiple moments whereas all these other characters in the kitchen eat his food as he's sort of trying to change, what this sort of stalwart beef shop in Chicago makes in their sandwiches, trying to change things, that like once they taste his food, like every single one is like, oh my God, right? Like it's just so good. So those are some that I'll throw out there. And then very shamelessly for a book, right? Like I think Zenia and I would both encourage people to look at food Instagram to be able to understand our current food media ecosystem, to understand the platform that's missing from Chef that would have been a really interesting part of the narrative if it had come out a few years later, that Instagram would have been a part of that story. And so we've got got chapters from contributors all over the world looking at Instagram from every possible angle. We talked about identity, but the sections on influence and on negotiation, really pushing what Instagram's about, what it makes possible, that it's not just beautiful Instagrammable food, that it is a far more dynamic and interesting place. So yeah, I could keep going forever, so I will stop there.
Thank you for going first, Emily. This is a tough question for me because I immediately started thinking about what are the food films that have just most touched me. And a lot of them I haven't seen in so long that I'm not sure how I would feel about them if I watched them now. Like the first film that came to mind immediately, which was so formative for me when I was a young adult, was Like Water for Chocolate. And I fell in love with the book and the film. And I mean, for me, being gifted the book at Christmas and I was reading it and there were like recipes in the midst of the novel, but they're not just add-ons. They're like those recipes, those ingredients are part of the story and they drive it forward. And each of these episodes of like cooking as a way of not only like holding the family together, but also enacting other things in the world, that magic realist power that's given to the cook. And it's not only a nurturing power, right? Like it is also sometimes a power that can be directed in different ways, like against one's enemies. and that to me was just incredibly, incredibly formative. And I just love the sensuality of it and how it, ties in the seduction element and the romance of cooking for someone you love or trying to woo, and just how much that connects you on that very sensual level. But
it's a sexy movie for a kid to watch.
Yeah,
I was much older.
But again, I haven't seen it in 20 years or something. And so I don't know how I'd feel about it today. And I also don't know, as a critical scholar now who's, trained in post-colonialism and, all kinds of things. And I might see it very differently. So I don't know what kinds of critiques are out there that might be very legitimate. So I'm almost a little bit nervous to talk about that, but it certainly was very powerful to me. And I think, a lot of my favorite films are a lot of the things that come up on top 10 lists. Like I really love Babette's Feast and Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, and many of these, Tempopo, and so many of these films that are not like new to food film lovers or not anything original. But, it also got me thinking about I do like films that play with surreal elements or sometimes the darker side of food. And so I've always been a Peter Greenaway fan. I love The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover, and just like restaurants as sites of intrigue and also Goodfellas, like places where all kinds of different elements and often the underground of society can come together and use the restaurant as a base for so many different forms of relationship and economy and money making and coercion, as well as always being a place people come back to eat, right, and to be nourished. And it's often central places of gathering for different ethnic communities, and so that can be wonderful. It can also have all these other dark sides to it. And so I like those kinds of things. And I also was thinking about, people who aren't necessarily known for being making food films. But for me, like Fellini is one of my favorite filmmakers. And he is somebody who has always integrated important elements of Italian food cultures into his films. And so Amarcord, has everyday working people gathering around the dinner table. And he was highlighting his own family's food, like his own family's cooking was foregrounded there. And he's always retelling his own story in some of his films, at least. His biography is kind of filling in. And I believe that Stanley Tucci, in a recent episode of his Italian food travel show, went to Fellini's home area and heard stories about just how central food was to him as an Italian coming home. That was, one of the things. He had his favorite dishes and his family members talk about how important it was to him. And so for him, those languages of film and food were inseparable, even if they were kind of subtle, right? Or not the main focus of his story. So I do love that. So I love Big Night. That's another one of my favorite food films as well. Another one is I was kind of looking around trying to remember and think about films. Another one that comes up in a lot of these lists, and I don't even remember it for its depictions of meals, but I know that they were central to the family comedy drama, was My Big Fat Greek Wedding, right? And this goes back a long way. And this is one of those classic, like, you want to marry into this family, you have to understand Greek culture, which means our traditions, which means our food, which means our everything that goes into that.
I love it.
And
he's a vegetarian, so I'll make the lamb. Like, I love that line.
I forgot that. I mean, it's such a great immersive film, and that was wonderful. And so my fun story about this is that it was set in Chicago, right? But it was actually filmed largely in Toronto, in Toronto's Greek area. We have a very large Greek town, and every summer Toronto has this Greek festival where more than 1 million people come, and the Danforth is shut down for, the whole weekend, and it's just this enormous food-oriented festival. And my family were actually friends with one of the actresses in the film, Stavroula Logothetis, who plays the feisty sister of the bride, right? And so she's, it's a bit of a side character for her, but she's just this wonderful, wonderful person and actress, and does a lot of live theater and everything. And so she would have us over for dinners, and she lived in the Greektown area. And so I just remember, like, her home Greek cooking, right? And just how much that sort of grew out of, and she was able to joke and talk about, like, the food in the film, but it also was her life, and just like being introduced to how she threw together such simple ingredients for such rich, delicious dishes. And so that, to me, through that personal connection, I guess has to make the list in there.
I love how you point not just to food films that we would consider like food films, but also like really fantastic films where food is used really effectively. Like, I think honestly, intellectually, like, those are the ones I sometimes find more interesting. As I think one that I'll end with, like, I don't think, Don't Look Up was a perfect or even a good film in a lot of ways, but spoiler alert, the final scene, right? That it's the end of times, it's the end of the earth. And so what do? You make a beautiful meal, and you sit around the table with who you love and who you're with, and you drink wine, and you dine together, you break bread together, and that's how you go out. Then I think as we think about what dinner scenes, in addition to sort of food pornographic cooking scenes and plating scenes and market scenes, that the way eating together around a table serves different kinds of narratives in film is really powerful. And so that's one that definitely comes to mind. If you have seconds to live, what would you do, right? Eat something wonderful with people who you love.
Oh, that's great. I forgot about that. Yeah, that's a really good one.
I love, people listening cannot see the way I squealed when Emily said Goodfellas, because it was the first thing that popped in my head because of the garlic scene, of the prison scene. I will watch that forever. Just the commentary, steak and, shrimp and lobster. Shrimp and lobsters were best. And then obviously, the making the sauce. And like you said, the sitting around the table eating, scenes like in The Godfather. The family sits around, and there's an order to the ways in which people are served. I remember in my family growing up, the elder men were always served first, the children second, and then the women of the family who actually made the meals ate last. And that was a very prideful thing for my grandmother, who did all the cooking. My grandmother and my Aunt Diana did all the cooking. They'd start baking well before Christmas, Thanksgiving, whatever it was. It was a pride thing for them. No, you go first. You eat first. We will eat last. Granddaddy eats first. Granddaddy always eats first, and nobody did anything. My grandfather's a very unassuming man, but it was an order of he goes first. He is the patriarch, so forth. The movie that kind of pops in my head, I'm going to give two because I'm going to pretend that the Goodfellas is also mine. There are two that immediately pop in my head. One is the animated version of Beauty and the Beast.
Oh, heck yeah!
Be Our Guest. Yes, my favorite song of any Disney movie of all time. God rest you, Jerry Orbach. Lumiere, you're just my boy. I will sing that song in my most ridiculous French accent any day of the week. I love that scene. Oh my gosh. As a former employee of the Walt Disney World College program.
Yes.
I mean, it makes me think that you almost need a whole separate episode on children's food films, because it's just like, that's its own array. Because I was thinking back, Willy Wonka, Ratatouille you talked about, like Charlotte's Web. There's so many of these films that teach children the importance of food, or how to be careful with food, food can be dangerous and all those things. Like, it's such a way of enculturating children to understanding the world and relationships that, I mean, children's food films are its own thing.
They really are. And, to get, kids into eating and to get them into the kitchen, understanding, you use food as this instrument to teach these larger roles about family, belonging, relationships, dynamics, and then things like, okay, where do these things come from? We talk so much. One of my favorite things in the world to do when I'm teaching, say, the Columbian Exchange in class is to have my students draw last night's dinner. And then we pick that apart and say, where did this come from? Where did that come from? Why? There's another film I want to talk about real fast, which is Sideways, which is a film I adore. We talked a little bit about Swingers. It kind of feels like the early 40s version of Swingers, where you've got these guys kind of figuring themselves out, one more successfully than the other. My love of wine kind of grew in part from that film. I still won't drink Merlot. As a result of that film, every time I look at that, I was just talking to someone the other day, I'm like, Malbec is everything Merlot wished it could be, but isn't. I think wine is this amazing channel to talk about, place and belonging, and also to this thing that you can share with people like food and so forth. I want to kind of come back and close on Chef itself. What's the legacy of Chef? And maybe your final thoughts here is Chef a history movie?
I think for the history of social media, this is definitely a history movie. It is a snapshot in time as we think about what platforms were being used, how they were a part of food marketing, how they were a part of the food scene. I think that's definitely part of it. We also never talked about blogs, right? But the idea that this critic, he doesn't write for the LA Times, right? Jonathan Gold would have still been writing for the LA Times at that time. He's a blogger, which is interesting. I think that was another slight anachronism, that sort of the bubble of food blogging had burst by 2014, but it had been this really influential space when we think about sort of Web 2.0 and a greater democracy for writers, that everybody could have a blog, anyone could have a Twitter account, that you could build your presence to create food content and to be able to be viewed as a critic. And so I think for a history of food digital media, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that we teach a lot in digital media, in order to help students and all of us get over that feeling that it's always changing, that's always of the future, always grasping towards the next thing, is that all of our social media forms have previous media forms folded into them. So they're always backward looking as well. And so, Instagram itself, right? It's taking Polaroid as its basic kind of reference point and repurposing that into not only its logo, but also the filters that it uses and that throwback aesthetic and the square shape and all of those sorts of things. And so we see that throughout the film, that it's telling us about how social media is changing things quickly, but about how social media is also always retelling us our history, even though it can be remixing it, condensing it, kind of chalking it up and giving it new life in sometimes frustrating ways and sometimes, distorting ways, but it's there. And if we look for it, we can use those conduits to think historically, even though the medium often doesn't want us to think historically, right? It wants us to just be in the present. We can take the time to see through those immediate impressions, photos, moments, and trace longer histories. So food blogs, which cite back to other older forms, right? So Instagram photos are used now to link to recipes, right? So that's a new kind of multimedia cookbook, right? But those histories of those older media are part of what we're looking at today always, if we look for the historical residues.
I think it could also be a primary source document for understanding what chocolate lava cake meant at a particular time.
You take a frozen cylinder of ganache and you set it in the ramekin so that as the outside cooks fully, the inside becomes molten.
Okay.
It's fucking molten, see? It's fucking molten, you asshole.
When I did my work to understand, Real Men Don't Eat Quiche when it comes out in the 80s, like I went back to the food section and, how did people write about quiche in the 70s and 80s? Like, where did it fit into brunch menus? There was this idea that it was just proliferating everywhere, right? That it was so tired and so everywhere, that like that's part of how it was being marshaled, right? In this book of parody. And so I think to understand what that dessert item meant and the tiredness of that whole menu, what it represented for our current food culture and sort of where new American cuisine is going, that it does freeze in time, sort of where that cuisine was and what those different dishes mean too.
Yeah. And so another historical point of interest is that it also marks or is an interesting depiction. As Emily pointed out, it's not the moment when it starts, but it kind of marks a culmination of the hipster appropriation of the food truck as a site of culinary travel and consumption and cosmopolitanism and food adventuring, really, right? So it comes out just a few years before a lot of these Silicon Valley startups are also borrowing from these other forms. Like you have that Silicon Valley, these two Silicon Valley bro dudes who take the concept of and the name bodega as what they call their kind of like vending machine that sells food in the way that that corner stores that are immigrant owned in big cities, trying to replace them while holding on to the nostalgia of that feeling and familiarity of the bodega, right? And so it's a moment where food trucks also are part of that, right? The working class source of food at the work sites, homemade food for immigrant communities, and sort of turning that into hipster commodity. So that's another historical point that's worth pulling out.
Well, let me ask you this. You're going back. Chef is re-released in 2023. You have the opportunity to go see this in the theater again or for the first time. What kind of snacks are you getting?
Great question. I mean, I'm always sneaking in sweet things. So I like chocolate and peanut combination, things like that. But I mean, something like this, there's no good desserts really for the most part. Like it is about good, savory, flavorful food. So this might warrant bringing in some kind of like really delicious taco or something.
I know. Maybe we could only go see it in New Orleans and we'd have to sneak in beignets. Like that would be the perfect thing. Like totally not a movie food, but I would go with this one.
And you walk out afterwards with all of the crumbles, icing sugar. Dead giveaway, but it's too late then.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Guys, thank you so very much for tuning in. Thank you in retrospect. Thank you so much to Emily and Zenia for coming on, I guess, twice now for the same pod. But make sure you are subscribed. Season 3 kicks off next week. And if you want to support Historians of the Movies, you can do so by going to Historians at the Movies Patreon page at patreon.com/Historians at the Movies. We'll catch you next time.